We didn't orchestrate this in advance. We did meet, but we just had a drink and didn't talk about this at all and got up on news. So, but Jim set up my, this is a perfect setup for what I'm about to say. Now, the brief, as you know, the title of this panel discussion is Mahatma to Modi, 70 years of Indian democracy. Now, the 70 years was completed on 15th August, and I just want to throw out a couple of ideas of, before I get to the substance of my remarks. There is a sense in India at the moment that 15th August this year marked a turning point in public discussions about the hegemony, the consensus that has existed around 2014 about the stridency of Hindu right-wing nationalism, of the Hindutva Brigade, and the weakening for the first time, a chink in the armor of the otherwise irrepressible Narendra Modi. His 15th August speech made on Independence Day did not have any of the flair that people have come to associate with him, and this is a master of political rhetoric we are talking about. We also know that he's a master of rhetoric and not very much else, but that's, we'll talk about that afterwards. Now, I always say this because we've had so many celebrations and marking and discussions of 70 years of Indian independence, really a milestone for Britain and her history as much as India and Pakistan. But for me, the 70 years of Indian independence is absolutely inextricably linked to the murder and assassination of Mahatma Gandhi on the 30th of January, 1948, months after India's independence. So by talking about the progression of Indian democratic ideas from Mahatma to Modi, we are talking really about the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, the man, but also the murder of an agenda, an idea, a disposition, a sensitivity, a philosophy. Now, there are many things one can say, and that people, and Shruti herself has written and worked on this. We can talk about it later, but if we were to take just one key idea that was enshrined in the Indian Constitution, which was very much part of, part of Gandhi's ideas, but that found its way because of many others into the Indian Constitution, is this idea of diversity. That diversity was desirable in this new nation. And it was an experiment in creating a different kind of democracy which was not modeled on European-style nationalism of one language, one nation, a homogeneity of political culture, which was precisely what the RSS, the organization to whom the assassin of Mahatma Gandhi belonged to. So our Prime Minister at the moment in India, Narendra Modi, has been a lifelong member of the RSS, as you know, so he belongs to the organization that murdered Gandhi. But for what we need to know is also they have always had, they didn't fight the freedom struggle. They weren't part of the independence struggle, number one. And number two, they were people who believed, literally by physically locating themselves in Germany, in Europe, about ideas of nationalism that were growing in Europe at the time, which was a completely different model to the one that the Indian nation eventually became. So the real threat, and last week Shruti Kapila, who many of you will know, the political philosopher, has been arguing, he was arguing in a talk last week, that really the real threat to democracy is not authoritarianism. We think authoritarianism is the antithesis to democracy. It is really majoritarianism. And majoritarianism is exactly what this agenda of Hindutva, of right-wing Hindu ideology, of this particular model of nationalism and nationhood is about. So I just want to park that set of ideas before I turn my attention to what I would like to talk about, springing off from what Jim said. Now, you've heard that Indians are very enthusiastic participants in the democratic process. It's a very lively electorate, and they're engaged and participate in a variety of different ways. Now, India is rare in having, in showing voter turnouts that go up in every election. every election sees more people voting. So, all this worry about apathy that we hear in Europe simply doesn't happen. Every election is an Obama-like election or a Brexit-like turnout. The people of the referendum in Scotland, there are high voters, there are lots of people show up. And there are various ways in which one can explain this. One must say that there is an enormous amount of money and financial corruption in Indian elections that exist, and this is very carefully documented by many. There's a huge amount of muscle power. It would, however, be a mistake to surmise on that basis that money and muscle is what drives people to the polling booths. There's now enough research to show that that is not the case. And in a quick summary would say that really the reason, yes, there are a number of different push factors that drive people to the polling booth, but there are also a lot of pull factors where people find the process, the act of voting, a meaningful one. So they like to vote. Going to the polling station and casting your vote is actually a meaningful act. And I won't elaborate on that just yet. If you want to ask me about it, I'll be happy to talk about it. Now, in this scenario, this is where we are 70 years into Indian democracy. Now let's look back to what Ambedkar said as the Indian Constitution was being finalized. He said, quote, "Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people are yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil which is essentially undemocratic." So the question really to ask is, in 70 years, have we done any better? Has this changed? Would Ambedkar feel encouraged? Would he notice that caste, in fact, is less practiced in village life now than 70 years ago? Now I just want to stay with that cultivation metaphor for a bit, partly because 2/3 of the electorate is rural. This is a rural country. Large parts of rural India, in fact, their human development indicators, and stunting is a major manifestation of it, are really quite poor. Adult illiteracy levels in rural India are still shockingly high. And yet, voter turnouts in rural India are extremely high. So where I've, for 15 years, went back and forth to the same two adjacent villages in West Bengal. And over this period of time, where I worked, which was very typical, it was sampled very carefully, my field site as an anthropologist, the voter turnout was 90%, adult illiteracy was 90%. Everybody just voted, that's what you did. Now, where does this impulse for participation come from? And this idea of cultivation is one that I would like to think with for the remainder of the time. I have, what, 3-4 minutes?
Yeah, under 5.
Okay. Now, this idea of Ambedkar's that democracy it's a top-down dressing. You can't impose a set of social theories about liberalism, liberal democracy, representation in a place and expect it to take root. And if Jim is to be believed, and I have no reason not to believe him, it seems to have taken root. So what is it that has allowed it to grow roots in the Indian context? And one way I would suggest is to think of the practices, the actual practice of cultivation of agriculture itself. Now, if you just stay with that for a minute, not the metaphorical version, but the real process of cultivation, you prepare the ground, you choose your seeds carefully, you water, you watch over it, you feed it, you watch the skies, you protect it from enemies, you keep animals off it, you look after it and nurture it until it is ready to harvest. And when you harvest it, then you're faced with the vagaries of the market and what price you're going to get for it, what the government has set, what the market's offering, and so then you're open to a different set of risks. Now, this is very much the process by which ideas of democracy are actually cultivated, and that's why I find the idea of or the notion of social imaginaries very useful to think with, because as Taylor argues, it's not social theory. People don't sit around talking about the theory of representation. They talk about what it is to be civil in public life, what it is to have accommodation, what it is, why is it so important to have dignity. And I can't talk about dignity enough, but we can come back to this. Self-respect and dignity, what it does to your sense of self, how do you create the common good, and so on. And what is useful with the idea of social imaginaries is that it has both the component of imagination, which is very important when you are a daily wage laborer in a toned sari with dirt under your fingernails, queuing next to somebody who's prosperous and wears an expensive watch in the polling booth queue, but you're not sent to the back because you arrived before. It is possibly the only moment in Indian public life when that doesn't happen. So it becomes very important and a very precious moment, and you begin to think of yourself as in completely different terms of universal citizenship. So imagination is important, but it also is not something that you sit and dream about. It is very rooted in social organization, in social life, and again, we can talk about this afterwards if you want to hear about how this might happen. So democracy basically can't be presupposed. It needs cultivation and it needs constant nurturing. And so I'll finally end with a story which brings these two, the metaphor and the real cultivation thing together, which I was told, I was there during a paddy harvest one year in the village, and the first harvest, and once you get the first paddy and the rice comes back from the mill, the first thing you do with the new harvest is make a pudding and you offer it in the mosque before it's consumed. It's a very standard Indian practice across religions. They said, this reminds me of the story, this man says, that this is just like voting. And I said, sorry, why is making a milk pudding like voting? And he said, because once there was a king and he asked the village, he said to the village, I'll have a feast for everybody. I'll supply all the food, come and eat. But the pudding is going to be something that all of you contribute to. So I'll provide the sugar, I'll provide the rice, but you bring the milk. So everybody bring a cup of milk and pour it into the vat in the middle of the village, and we make a pudding. So everybody lifts the lid and empties their cup, and there was a miser who thought, why should I give up my, he was a free rider basically. He said, well, I'll just take a cup of water, nobody will notice. So he lifted the lid and put in a cup of water. At the end of the feast, everybody in eager anticipation waits for the milk pudding. They open the lid and the vat is full of boiling water. Everybody had the same thought. And so this is the idea that it brings together ideas of participation, of doing your own little thing in order to make the common good, that collective goods are impossible to achieve without everybody doing their bit. This is how ideas of democracy are cultivated.
Thank you.